Welcome to Southwest Florida Real Estate Update, hosted by area realtor Jim York and York Real Estate Group of Downing Fry Realty. Our show will bring you the most up-to-date information about the local real estate market, featuring leading experts in the real estate field.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Southwest Florida Real Estate Update. I'm Michael York with the York Real Estate Group, and I'm joined today by our host Jim York and his guest Don Ross of Ross Title and Escrow.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Well, Don, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The show today, what we're going to do is try and talk to the viewers from people from up north and tell them what the procedure is about buying property in the state of Florida, and not necessarily in a region, but the whole state of Florida.
Okay.
So let's start with if a person's coming down here from up north, where should they start when they're looking to buy property here?
Well, it's as we were talking about before the show, this is unique from where I grew up, New England, where you came from, the Midwest, in that the people up north don't necessarily have at their fingertips a good banker, a good insurance person, an attorney, a realtor. So I would say they need somebody, realtor, lawyer, both, the team. They need a team. A team is more critical where we live here than where I grew up in Boston, or where, I forget where you came from.
Syracuse, New York?
Syracuse, New York, where everybody knows everybody.
That's right.
And you know your own handyman, your own electrician, your own insurance person, your own banker, and so forth. Down here, unlike many other parts of the country, particularly the north, they don't have those contacts. So interviewing Jim York or myself is critical. You know, how much experience do you have? How many transactions do you actually handle? And you have a background as a builder, if I remember.
Right.
My father was a builder. So I think that would be the first thing, and when they get to me, I try to impress upon them, you know, I'm from up north, I understand it. I have family that does real estate closings in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, a son in Atlanta who does real estate closings, he's a real estate attorney, another son in DC, you know, who's bought several homes up there, and plus other family members. So we're uniquely, I think, qualified to compare and contrast what's it like and what you should look for that's different than what you experience back home in Chicago or Illinois or Syracuse or Cape Cod than down here.
Yeah, I know we just had a classic example with a contract that a client from New York purchased, and in New York contracts, in the state of Florida, you have a closing date of whatever date it is. In New York, it doesn't necessarily have to close on that particular date.
Oh, I don't know if I've done this before, but my family has reunions on Virginia Beach, and on my mother's side, they're all lawyers or doctors, and the lawyers are all real estate lawyers.
Right.
And one of them is a vice president in the holding company for Stewart Title. I mean, so he does claims, throughout a very large region. And they're all envious that down here the closings are somewhat streamlined in that realtors, for example, can use forms. And here are all my lovely forms. The NABOR and the FAR contracts. Right. Up in New York, a lawyer drafts the contract, and that might take a couple of weeks. Massachusetts, where I grew up, they'll have an offer sheet, which is somewhat like a letter of intent. It's not binding. And then they'll go to what they call the P&S, the purchase and sale, which would be your actual contract to sell or purchase the real estate. So people who are moving or looking down here, they might be near retirement age and they've bought 1 or 2 properties their entire life. It's intimidating enough. But to go to an area where they don't know anybody other than Jim or Don, they need the team. They really who can they trust, and hopefully it's somebody who's competent.
That's right.
Who has their fingers at their fingertips a good team. I have my legal team. You have your banks and your insurance people and your
Inspection.
contractors and inspection companies. They make a huge difference. I mean, one link in that chain falls apart, and the closing becomes a nightmare. I mean, we've got one right now where the people are from up north, they're buying down here, and we have mold that was tested for. And the mold reading outside of the unit, the way that the NABOR contract, and here's all the NABOR forms.
I know, it's a lot of
Isn't that
them.
a lot of fun? But the NABOR form has a standard written by attorneys, not scientists, attorneys. So it's useful to find defects that before they become major issues, but it's not really a scientific test. And what it measures is whether the mold inside is higher than the mold outside. Well, the outside in this particular case, and this is a call I got yesterday while I'm at the airport, was how do we remediate a test score where the inside is higher than the outside when the outside was 0? How is that possible?
Right.
Well, did it rain? Because if it rains, that affects the reading outside.
That's right.
If the sellers were packing all their belongings in boxes inside, that drives up the score. So how do we deal with that? Well, what we're going to end up doing in that case is contacting the other attorney and saying what score will be acceptable, because it's not probable, unless we do a test after another rainstorm, that you're going to have a 0 reading outside, and you're never going to get a 0 reading inside. I mean, as soon as you scrub every square inch of the place and then you walk in the door, boom, there's some mold. So explaining that to people up north, the role of mold, the importance of teams, how our contracts differ, how we essentially have 50 little countries with our 50 states, and you have different curative statutes and a whole host of issues is critical.
Okay, Don, we're gonna take a little short break here, and then when
Okay.
we come back, we're gonna maybe talk about the 2 different contracts that we have here in Southwest Florida versus the state of the state. Okay?
Sure.
So we'll be back in 1 minute.
When picking a realtor, don't just pick anyone. Pick someone with experience. Pick someone with a proven track record. Pick a realtor like Jim York from Downing Fry Realty, the #1 brokerage with the most real estate transactions in the area.
My husband and I had very specific ideas about what we wanted in our new home. Jim York was able to help us find the home that was ideal for us.
With over 20 years of real estate experience in Southwest Florida, Jim York has negotiated over $200 million in sales contracts. Selecting the right realtor is a critical decision that can earn you thousands when selling or save you thousands when buying.
Jim also helped us with a mortgage lender and a good real estate attorney. He went that extra mile, and his experience says it all.
Call Jim York for a no-obligation meeting at 239-273-6727 or visit his website, www.naplesyorkrealestate.com.
Welcome back, Don. Let's. You got 2 large books there, okay? So let's talk about what do you have there, because they're all about contracts, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I hate to pull back the curtain, but this, whenever I get a question, it's usually about one of the forms. This is the Naples Board of Realtors contracts. There's approximately 75 or so forms. And then here's the Florida Association of Realtors, FAR, and the FAR Bar, which is the Florida Association of Realtors and the Florida Bar. This particular version is used in 99% of the state of Florida.
Okay.
When they have seminars in Orlando or other places that I go to, they'll have a class on FAR Bar contracts. The Naples Board of Realtors contract is strictly this area. So you poor guy, you need to know
Both
150 forms,
That's right.
roughly, and how they compare to each other, because there's radical differences between the two. And if you're not knowledgeable about the financing contingency between the one in NABOR versus FAR Bar, you're going to have issues. If you're not knowledgeable about what's included in as something you can inspect for in the regular FAR Bar versus NABOR, you have a major problem. And I've had that. The FAR Bar doesn't list as a defective item mold and radon. NABOR does. People care about mold and radon. So you need to know if you're a realtor or if you're somebody from up north using a particular form contract, it'd be nice if somebody could go over it with you and explain it to you and point out things that are significant down here, which again, if you're from up north, you might not be, it might not be a fact of life that mold is an issue. I mean, they get the freezing sub-zero
That's
temperatures that would kill a lot of the mold. Down here, we're in a semi-tropical climate next to the Everglades, so it's part of our normal maintenance.
Yeah, it brings back the point of having a team together and surrounding yourself, if you're a buyer coming down here to the state of Florida, to have a knowledgeable realtor or a knowledgeable attorney, because to know all those forms, it's not a part-time job learning them. It's more than a full-time job.
It's continuous, and when issues come up along the closing process, let's say you have a contract signed, something comes up and the buyer wants to move in early or the seller wants to stay late, it's a whole lot easier to realize they have a form for that.
That's right.
And the FARBAR one, again, is different. And why is it different? And which one should we use? And being able to reassure your buyer or your seller that this is okay and this is exactly what it does is helpful. With the changes we've had with the Foreign Investors Real Property Tax Act, the FIRPTA, as we call it, the changes in the financing law, Dodd-Frank.
That's right.
All these are reflected in these forms. And down here, it's big because we have a lot of non-residents purchasing and selling down here. So you got to know it. And you do, with this economy, see a lot of seller financing because it's a nice rate of return versus whatever the stock market is doing today.
Yeah. Or money in the bank.
Yeah.
How about using, people come down here and they really don't fully understand the difference between using an attorney and a title company. Could you just explain that a little for our viewers?
Well, in interest of full disclosure, I am an attorney, but I have a title company and I do own part of a law firm. I'm a member of a law firm. You really need a lawyer. You need a lawyer in the equation somewhere who's familiar with real estate law down here, who does a fair volume of real estate law down here. Because just from some of the issues I just raised earlier,
right.
FIRPTA, what is that? I mean, I've got a case right now where my seller is here on an O1 visa, which is somebody of special importance, designation, who is allowed to stay in this country. He's a former member of the Special Forces in the UK. and he had no idea about FIRPTA. He had no idea that they're going to withhold 15% of his sales proceeds. And he actually accused us of being biased against Irish people. I am Irish. One of my kids went to school in Ireland. My mother-in-law is from Tipperary.
Right.
I mean, so once we got past that, and I was able to explain to him what it meant and here's how you deal with it, he was fine. So you need somebody who can explain to you, especially down here, the significance of this tax law or the seller financing law, the Dodd-Frank law, or we had one that was supposed to close yesterday and there was a financing contingency and the buyer was threatening to sue and they didn't want to waive their contingency. And under both contracts, you get an extra 10 days to close if you waive your financing contingency, but they didn't want to do it. So they need somebody they can talk to who can explain to them 2 or 3 or 4 different options of how to approach this that might be attractive to the seller in this case. And I'm sitting in the airport yesterday doing exactly that on a seller financing transaction to somebody who's from Indianapolis. And they're so upset that they have a hard time analyzing it. They're so emotional. It's tough when you're emotional. And if you can bring them down to earth a little bit and say, here are 3 or 4 different ways to sell it to the seller, it gets done. And of course, I walked in this morning and one of the solutions were used, and thankfully it's going to close.
Let's go into this other subject here. I get a lot of questions from people up north about abstract title and title insurance. Could you explain that for our viewers?
Okay, an abstract is, I used to read these, now everything's online with computers. Abstracts used to be like this thick.
Okay.
okay? And it would have the history of the property as portrayed in the public records from the beginning of the state of Florida to now. And I'd actually have a 8.5 by 14 piece of paper with lines that would run vertically down it. And on one side, I'd list the deeds.
Right.
So I could make sure that the current owner actually owns it and there wasn't a defect with any of the prior conveyances. And then the other side would have anything that affected the deed, mortgages, judgments, liens, things of that sort. So we could, and then we would type up our own title insurance commitment. So from a layman's perspective, an abstract of title is simply a history of the property with no promises whatsoever behind it.
Okay.
There's no promise even that it's complete. They could miss things because these pieces of paper in the abstract are recorded under people's names and the legal description of the property. And all it takes is whoever's getting paid minimum wage at the county courthouse to
Right.
file it in the wrong, under the wrong name,
That's
the wrong
right.
piece of property, and you miss a mortgage. And I've had that happen a number of times. The title insurance will insure if that abstract is missing something.
Okay.
Okay, the title insurance will ensure that you have marketable title. An abstract doesn't insure anything,
Okay.
not a thing. And I've used this before, but my father-in-law sold some property in Hingham, Massachusetts, which is a very wealthy area, 40 acres right in the middle of a residential wealthy town. And he used, he didn't get, the buyer didn't use a title insurance company with a good lawyer involved. They just had an abstract of title. And they missed something.
Right.
And it ended up costing my father-in-law $50,000. So when he went to buy another property in Sagamore, Massachusetts, I got involved because all I heard about was the other fiasco, and I used my underwriter to close his purchase, and I looked at everything, even though I'm not licensed in Massachusetts, but he's my father-in-law. I at least can point out the basics, and made sure that he at least was covered, and he is, and he's had no issues. So an abstract of title, again, is just the basis from which you can prepare a title insurance commitment.
Okay.
Okay? No promises with the abstract or certificate of title.
Right.
Not promising that it's marketable, not promising there's nothing missing, not promising that there was fraud, no fraud involved, or a minor signed something. And you know, you would need somebody to look at that abstract and say, hey, they're missing a witness, and down here, you know, it's a big deal or it's not a big deal because it's, you know, more than 5 years old. You know, to interpret that, it'd be like reading a medical journal.
That's right.
You know, if you're not a doctor, so what? You have no idea what you're looking at.
Well, Don, we're going to take another little short break.
Sure.
And when we come back, I want to talk about the different costs that's involved when you're doing a closing in the state of Florida versus up north. Okay?
Sure, sure.
We'll be right back. Thank you.
Thinking of buying or selling a home in Naples, Marco, Bonita, or Estero, Florida? Think of the most experienced York Real Estate Group associated with the #1 brokerage in Naples, Downing Fry Realty, which produced $1.9 billion in sales in 2014, controlling 43% of all transactions in Naples. Jim, Michael, and Morgan York make up the York Real Estate Group of Downing Fry Realty. With over $250 million in sales transactions, they can offer you the expertise and trust you want and need in a realtor. Call them today at 239-273-6727 or visit their website, www.naplesyorkrealestate.com.
Welcome back. Don, you know, a lot of people come down here from up north or Midwest or wherever it is, and they're not used to what our closing costs are versus what they paid in their area. So maybe you could just explain the different taxes that we have, and maybe overall a rule of thumb of a percentage maybe they could use, if that's if you could do that or not.
Okay.
So let's start with our tangible taxes.
Well, that's the big thing down here. I get a lot of, you know, what the heck is this from
Right.
clients. when you get a mortgage, for example, if you're the purchaser, there is an intangible tax on the mortgage, which is $2 per thousand, 2 mils. And then there's a documentary stamp tax on the promissory note, 35 cents per hundred. You can integrate those two numbers into one number of $5.50 per thousand. So if you're getting a $100,000 mortgage, it's $550 tax. Now the buyers usually are less than happy about that.
Right.
And I try to explain it by pointing out that Florida does not have a state income tax. So this is a consumption tax, and that's how the state is run.
That's right.
And you know, sometimes you can use a little levity and say, well, what would you prefer? You know, a tax on the mortgage or a state income tax? You know, for somebody who's buying a $4 million condo, it's usually, oh, I'll pay the intangible tax and the documentary stamp tax. The seller has a documentary stamp tax on the deed, which is $7 per thousand. So $1 million property, it's $7,000. $1 million mortgage is $5,500.
Right.
So the NABOR contract allocates those two costs between the seller and the buyer. The seller pays the doc stamps always, and the buyer pays the intangible tax and the doc stamps on the mortgage and note always. It's an effort to be equitable between the two parties and share
Sharing the
the cost somewhat. It's a policy decision that was made by the Legal Resources Committee. Occasionally I get clients who, well, I'm going to borrow it from my company up north, or I'm going to use an equity line on my home up north, or I'm going to do an unsecured note with my company, but then they speak to their accountant. And the accountant generally requires that it be secured against this real estate to deduct it. So whenever somebody gets creative like that, I always recommend talk to your accountant, because I don't know their financial situation, other than in many cases they're wealthy. But you know, again, the team concept.
That's right.
You have an accountant.
Yep.
He's on your team. Run it by him. Run it by your estate planner as well while you're at it. They'll tell you how to take title. And if the accountant can tell you whether or not that those interest payments are going to be deductible, in many cases is quite significant. So I've had more than my share of people come back and say, well, I guess we're going to do the mortgage in Florida because I want to be able to deduct these payments. So those are the two big taxes, you know, the deed and then the mortgage and note. The other big expense is the title insurance, and with this NABOR contract, the buyer pays it if it's in Collier County, the seller pays it if it's in Lee or Hendry, but the buyer selects who.
Right.
So those are the major expenses. If you're getting a loan, you're going to get a lender's estimate 3 days after you apply for the loan, and that'll list all the bank fees and expenses they have in addition to the expenses that we just discussed.
How about if somebody, we might have answered this question before, but if somebody is coming in the state of Florida, what would they need to look for that would be a red flag if they're purchasing property in the state of Florida?
Oh, good one. What would they have to look for? Well, I mean, people coming into the state, if they're gonna, I always ask them, are you changing, is this gonna be a home? Is this gonna be a domicile? Because they're usually coming from Connecticut or New York or Illinois or Minnesota or Massachusetts, you know, not to leave my state out of it. And they're hoping to avoid the income taxes from that particular state. So I always recommend that they look for or call their accountant back home, for want of a better phrase, and ask what is the criteria in Massachusetts or New York or Connecticut or Illinois for somebody qualifying as a resident there. And almost always, you know, Illinois has a statute, and it's 20 to 30 variables they look at, and you need to prepare for the ultimate audit down the road from the state of Illinois or Connecticut, which I've had clients have 2-year audits with Connecticut, rather than, you know, what Florida requires. Florida's requirements are quite liberal because we don't have an income tax.
That's right.
You're not going to be audited for something that doesn't exist. It's where you're coming from that you'll be audited for. Counterintuitive. It doesn't register with most people until I put it that way. Why would we care, other than the ad valorem tax on the real estate? If we don't have an income tax, we're not going to audit you for it. So you look for that. You look for the team again. You look for what kind of life you're going to be living down here, what sort of amenities you want.
That's
I
right.
mean, if you're my age or older, the hospitals, the classes you can take. If you're into boating or golf, what are the communities like down here? The growth of the area, usually rent. I mean, my family rented for a couple of years before what they bought down here in the early 70s. And I would say that's probably the high points. I mean, I could go on and on, but those are the high points.
And if somebody is moving here in moving to the state of Florida, I know we're located here in Naples, and I know I could help them anywhere in the state of Florida, or recommend another realtor that maybe specializes in that particular area. But how about in your instance, can they call you and use you as their closing agent?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably 2/3 of my closings are what we call mailaways, where the people are located in another state, another country, and they don't even come here.
Right.
And at least half the closings are cash.
Right.
So you're wiring money and you're emailing closing statements. You've got 8 bazillion phone calls. I was on the phone this morning with a gentleman who was selling an expensive home, and he's got an escrow fight now over $400,000. So, a lot of it, we live in a virtual world.
That's right,
these
we do.
days, where your physical location is meaningless for the most part. I mean, there's virtual offices, virtual assistants. I use them.
Right.
We talked about using them ourselves. So there's no limitation. And again, the FARBAR form, which your Collier realtors and attorneys, we know them. They're used throughout the state. My nephew bought a house up in Cape Canaveral recently, and he emailed me the contract so I could go over it with him and the lender's estimate and explain some of these interest charge and what are these fees and so forth. And he's quite a bright young man. I'm a degree in astrophysics and an MBA in finance, and so he needed Uncle Don to help him out. So I do it quite frequently.
Well, Don, I want to thank you for coming on the show today, and I'm sure our viewers will be calling you and hopefully the York Real Estate Group also, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month, okay?
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thank you.